I was beginning to panic. I've been trying to get on since 5.
Hi. Sorry about that. I don't know what, I was trying to use my desktop upstairs, and for some reason the sound was just not working.
Okay, I thought it was the college. I said a whole day is deciding that it's going to be slow. So anyway, okay. Typical. I was really beginning to get a little bit worried there.
And Catherine, I apologize. I haven't had access to email today, so I haven't seen your last email or the agenda or anything. So I will be guided by you.
That's okay. That's okay. What I'm going to do is I did change my settings so that everybody should be able to share their screen. However, I am going to make people co-hosts just to make sure.
And I'm trying to get out of my, let's see how I can end. Okay. Oh.
Just 1 second.
5:29.
Co-host.
Catherine?
Yes.
Would you mind giving like a 15-second warning? Not like a 30-second warning when you're about to go live? Because Leonie just took a phone call really quick, just so she knows to run back.
Okay. Yeah, that's fine. I think that
Mr. Stavo, he's in the hospital.
Oh, is he?
Yes, and I didn't want him to think, I haven't been trying to reach him,
Is it serious?
It's his kidney, so like potentially, yeah. He's only operating on like less than 20%.
we're waiting for Whitney to join us.
Okay. Yeah, Ms. Brock, that call was just from Eugene Stavo. He has no idea about this webinar because he's in the hospital.
Oh,
Oh,
dear.
I'm so sorry.
Yeah, so I wanted to take it just to let him know what was happening, and I'll
I'm
call
gonna
him.
go get something.
Okay.
Yeah, he's not well.
Now, to my kind regards when you do speak
I
to him.
will. I will.
And then after this day is over, if there's more news, you have my email if you wouldn't mind letting me know what's happening.
Sure.
If you're allowed, of course.
Yeah, with his permission, sure. I'm sure he wouldn't mind. Yeah.
And how is everything else at the moment in Bermuda?
You're not here? I was wondering, is she here?
I'm in Cambridge, Massachusetts.
Okay, so is that behind you? Is that a mural or is that real? Because it looks like
No, that's just the screen, whatever it is, of Cathedral Island in Bermuda.
That's what I thought. It looks like Bermuda. It's tricky.
It is. Catherine, nice to meet you.
It's lovely to meet you, and thank you, Professor Blakey, for being able to make it as well. Nice to meet you, Leonie.
I'm excited. Yes.
In person. Hopefully Whitney will be able to come. I know she had some problems. We had an advisory board the other day, and she's on our international advisory board. I think she had a few problems connecting, so it may be an issue, but so we can wait maybe a few minutes. Let's see whether she sent an email.
Excuse me.
No, nothing from her yet. I don't know. What do you guys feel that we should just get cracking?
I would say yes.
Yeah, because she will come in, I think. So I will give you a warning now, right? I'm going to press start the webinar, and if you could all put yourselves on mute just to keep things a little bit quiet in the background noise, and I will then click.
Can you show me how to put mute? Because I don't see it on here.
Okay. All right, here we go. And I think I'm recording. I'm recording, yes. Okay, start. Here's Rui. And our attendees are filing in.
Hello.
Hi, Rui.
Good to see you all.
How are you doing?
Great, great.
Great. Are you in Paris?
I am.
Okay.
It looks like a French room, right?
I'm just going to type into the chat that people can, or actually I can just say out loud to the people that are coming in that they can use the chat just to say hello, but if they have questions, if they could please use the Q&A button in order to pose questions, and we will be able to get to those at the end of the session tonight. So if you could do that, that would be just great.
I apologize in advance that there might be some glitches when I'll be speaking, because my Wi-Fi connection here at the pension is not very steady. So
Okay.
I apologize in advance.
Okay. I'm just waiting to see whether any more attendees are coming in. Okay. And I'll just get started. There's some hellos coming in to the chat. Good evening, everyone. My name is Catherine Draycott, and I'm in the Department of Archaeology at Durham University. I am a Bermudian, and I was recently very lucky to participate in the Truth and Reconciliation community conversations that are run by Citizens Uprooting Racism in Bermuda, or CURB, which is one of the partners of this seminar. And I'm also very thankful to one of the descendants of those who are buried at the site, Haile Mariam, for taking me to actually visit this site some time ago. And I can attest that, and I think Leonie will attest this too, it's a dangerous site to visit. Golf and graveyards are not compatible sites. The webinar tonight grew out of an invitation extended through CURB for a lecture on the sites by one of the descendants, and Leonie was approached by CURB, and it's grown into a panel webinar modeled on the very successful panels that were put on by the Society of Black Archaeologists last summer, which some people here may have attended. Decolonizing, as referenced in the title, will probably by now be a familiar word to most people in universities, academia, and in heritage, but also in Bermuda, because it's a word that's been in the news recently as something that's been frustratingly slow in progressing in terms of politics on the island. And the decolonizing here addresses not only acts of colonization and the legacies of those of that structure, that social structure, but also it aims at decolonizing in method as well, since the method of conduct of decolonizing manifestly should not colonize research opportunities, but let those who have a sense of ownership lead. And above all, what's central to the Truth and Reconciliation community conversations run by CURB, to listen. I think I can say that the organizers, really felt that this was not going to be contained in just one event, and that there may be other events that spring off of this. So we'll look forward to that. But I will now step into the background, and I will pass you over to the real host and the moderator for this evening, Cordell Riley, who is the works in institutional research at Bermuda College and is a former government statistician. He has lectured widely on various aspects of business and tourism, but also on the history of racism in Bermuda. He's the vice president of CURB and the former president of CURB. And I'm going to now hand over to Cordell. So thank you very much and goodbye from me.
Good evening, everyone, and good evening to our panelists this evening. It's a distinct pleasure for me to be your host this evening. We certainly want to thank Dr. Draycott for all the efforts that she's put into getting this forum off the ground, and certainly to our own program director, Roger Dambrook, who has also assisted in getting this panelist and this program off the ground. We have a quite insightful and enlightening program for you tonight. We've got several panelists, as I mentioned. We're gonna start off with Leonie Junis, who is no stranger to the Bermudian audience. She's gonna give us a talk about Tuckerstown. I must confess that we are indeed related, and we both have descendants. We are descendants from the Tuckerstown people, and we both have ancestors in the grave in Tuckerstown. So this is something that is very near and dear to my heart. So I'm gonna give her a proper introduction. Leonie Junis is an independent historical researcher who has presented research on human rights and Bermuda history. Her focus on Tuckerstown includes recent articles, A Lost Place of Refuge and Trading Places, Correcting the Outer Bridge Era. Also in 2016, she gave a lecture at the Bermuda College titled The Tuckerstown Community, 1830 to 1930. Leonie has traced her Bermuda ancestry to the pre-emancipation period and only discovered as an adult woman that her maternal great-grandfather, Jonathan Jesse Smith, was born in Tuckerstown and was a trustee of the Marsden Methodist Church. He was buried in the Tuckerstown Cemetery in 1930. Leonie has been driven by a passion to find the hidden truth about what happened to that Methodist burial ground now sitting landlocked below a golf club driving range. So without any further ado, I'm going to turn this over to Leonie.
Is helping me. This is my first webinar. Okay. Can you all see the screen? Yes, okay. I know that I probably should have focused on a presentation that would be like I was speaking to people for the first time. But my focus has been on the ancestral boundaries of the cemetery and basically the walls that surrounded the cemetery originally. I will say, for the benefit of the audience, that the cemetery is landlocked, as Cordell introduced in my introduction. It is landlocked in the middle of a golf course, and it sits directly below a practice driving range. So it is constantly being riddled with golf balls, either flying over it or landing inside of it. That is not my focus in this presentation. You'll see the topic of my presentation is a quote from Habakkuk in the Old Testament: "For the stone shall cry out of the wall." What you're looking at here is a photograph that was taken after the removal of all of the gravestones and markers and part of the wall in 2012. And that incident became the catalyst for a report done by the former ombudsman, Ms. Brock, who is with us today, called A Grave Era. And she will speak more on that. So this presentation is about finding the original Methodist burial ground in Tuckerstown. And this is just a snapshot, a collage of some of the things we will be looking at. And we are going to be going from prior to starting in the 1830s, but we're going to be looking specifically at an 1880 Tea Party, a Savage map, and how a cemetery wall was erased. We'll be looking at those graphics in detail at a later time. So we're going to start in 1831 with the Wesley Methodist community, the fledgling Wesley Methodist community in Tuckerstown. Wesley Methodism had been introduced to Bermuda in the late 1700s. And by 1831, we have a very small community in Tuckerstown that are Wesley Methodist. And the graphic that you see with the handwriting is a snapshot from a minute book of the Wesley Methodist community in Bermuda, which is found in the archives. And they were looking at the various branches in Bermuda, in the various parishes, the various communities. And of course, I'm focusing on Tuckerstown. And I've transcribed the handwriting to make it easier to read. And it says, Tuckerstown has happily gone on in the way of improvement, so that there is scarcely a family in which we have not one or more members. Much unity and simplicity prevails among this poor people. So great a change was presented at the Christmas holidays that all were ready to exclaim, "What hath God wrought?" And then it makes a note that there were 22 members at that time, and of that 22, 2 were white, and the remaining 20 were described as free. This in contrast to some other communities in the Wesley Methodist region in Bermuda that did note that some in the congregation were actually still slaves. But the Tuckerstown, the colored people there were free. A couple of years later, they actually list the names of those 22 individuals. And I've transcribed the names, we can just run through them, but Mr. Samuel Trott was classified as the assistant leader. And then you have a litany of Smiths, Trotts, Richardsons, a couple of Haywards, a Calder, and an Outerbridge. But these were the members of that original Methodist community in Tuckerstown. And it's quite exciting to have discovered their names. Amongst these members, you will also see some names that you may recognize. Ms. Brock, for instance, there is a Josiah Smith, just past halfway mark. His wife, Kitsy Smith. There is also a Mingo Smith, and although it's not a part of, and his wife, Lettuce Smith, although it's not a part of this presentation, there is evidence that the stone chapel, which was subsequently built in the 1860s, was on land that was conveyed by Mingo Smith to the church trustees. So we moved to 1837 just to show that the Wesleyan community was active. What they called missions in Bermuda were very active, and they used to have anniversary sermons. This particular year in 1837, you will see that it's anniversary sermons of the Bermuda Wesleyan Missionary Society, which will be preached in the following places. And they've got Somerset, Bayless Bay, Tuckerstown, Warwick, St. David's, St. George's, and Hamilton. And so the Tuckerstown community was active and doing their studies and having their missions and their meetings. The reason why I'm dwelling on building the fact that there was a Wesleyan Methodist community there is because that is very relevant to the cemetery and its beginnings. Around about 1859, and this is from a letter which was published in the Gazette, the Royal Gazette, in 1889, in which the writer refers to his previous visit to Tuckerstown approximately 30 years before. So he says, but perhaps some may like to hear a word of the inhabitants of this sylvan retreat. With one or two exceptions, they are all of African descent, and kinder or more hospitable people are not to be found in Bermuda's Fair Isles. When I first visited the place some 30 years ago, there were only 2 or 3 houses and an old wooden chapel in the valley. This wooden chapel will play a role in even trying to ascertain the original boundaries of the cemetery, as will become apparent. And so now we visit that tea meeting. I call it a tea party, but it was classified as a tea meeting and a concert. This is an ad from the Royal Gazette placed in 1880 in June for a meeting and concert that was going to take place on the 8th of July, which is going to be a week from today, anniversary. And this ad is very unique and precious because it's the only thing that I've been able to find in the public record that actually mentions the cemetery. So the community was having a tea meeting and a concert will be held at Tuckerstown on the 8th of July next, in aid of the erection of a wall around the Methodist burial ground of that place. Tea meeting commences at 2 p.m., admission 1 and 6, and the concert commences at 7:30, admission 1 shilling. So the community was intent on building a wall around here. And so this ad shows that obviously there was a substantive cemetery there for them to even want to raise money to build a wall around it. How long it was there, we do not know, but this is definitely a key point in the history of the cemetery and its existence. So the question I ask is, where did the Tuckerstown community build their wall? And where was this wall in relation to the original wooden chapel? And this is where Habakkuk comes in, because in our search, the stone shall cry out of the wall, and the beam out of the timber shall answer it, that wooden chapel. So approximately 20 years after their tea meeting, Lieutenant Andrew Savage, Royal Engineer, was commissioned to survey the whole islands of Bermuda. And so we end up with what we call the Savage map, which was published around 1900, 1901. But all of the data that was collected was between 1898 and 99. So we see that Lieutenant Savage has drawn in the walls of a cemetery in Tuckerstown. And I dare say these were the walls built by that Methodist community. Now, it's an odd shape, and you may think, well, where is the cemetery? You see the word cemetery, you see some solid lines that form sort of like a triangular shape, and then you see some dotted lines above that, which we're not sure if that's contours or what it is. And so what I did was, let's look at other cemeteries in Mr. Savage's maps to get an idea as to how he describes them and where he actually writes the wording. So here we have the military cemetery out at near the RAA Club, going out towards Fort St. Catherine. Some of you may be familiar where that is. This is the Savage map. It shows that sort of triangular shape there of the military cemetery with a solid line. And the word cemetery is to the right of that plot, that burial plot. Here we have this relatively small cemetery in, it's called the Yellow Fever Cemetery in Ferry Reach. And as you can see, that is sort of like a panhandle shape with the short panhandle, with the word cemetery quite large to the right of that. And then we have the cemetery still in Ferry Reach, still a relatively small cemetery, which is east of the, before you get to the Martello Tower. And that is represented, I wish I had a pointer. I can't point, can I? They can't see me. The cemetery is that rectangular shape right next to the Y of the word cemetery. There is a pointer? Oh, okay. Okay.
They should be able to see.
Oh, okay. Can you see the pointer? Okay. So we now come back to a close-up of the cemetery at Parkerstown. So you once again see the solid line of the triangular shape that has no base. And there are some dark representative buildings just towards the base of that rectangular shape. I looked at this for so long and compared this to what is there now, and I just could not reconcile the two. The cemetery that is currently there bears no resemblance at all. And the question we ask is, what happened? So what Savage recorded as the cemetery is not what is there today. So on the left, we have the Savage cemetery with the solid lines forming a triangular shape. And to the right, we have the current 2018 Department of Planning map, which shows the cemetery here as this elongated, very thin, odd shape. It's like almost like a little shard, a little sliver of something. So what happened is the question. Fortunately, in last year, I think to be exact, the Library of Congress has digitized records which can help us to find out what happened to the cemetery. And these records are maps by the Olmsted brothers, who were hired by the Bermuda Development Company in the 1920s to do topographical maps of the area, which had just been compulsorily purchased through the Government Act, the Bermuda Development Company Acts. The collection, and I want to thank my dear friend and colleague, Ms. Caitlin Conyers. She's also, I believe, a member of CURB and plays a role with CURB. I had seen that the Library of Congress had these documents, but they were not digitized, and the only way to see them would be to travel over there. And Caitlin informed me, and she sent me an email last year with a link that these documents were now digitized. And in the link of the actual maps, there were 240 odd items. And I went through each item and I found this one item that shows that the original triangular walls that are itemized as the cemetery by Savage. On the left, you have the Savage map. And on the right, you have the Olmsted map from the early 1920s. It has no date on it per se, but I know that Olmsted was hired by the Bermuda Development Company in the early part of the 1920s. We're going to zoom in a minute, but you'll see the triangular shape here going up and down. The walls are intermittent. They're not continuous like in the Savage map. So either they are hidden by, I don't know, foliage or whatever, or they have been broken up and they're not as complete as they were. There is a gap here between part of the wall on the right-hand side, but the wall goes all the way down. And you'll see the next slide that I've filled it in so that you can see how it compares. So once again, you can see, I've actually filled it in with a dark black line, the wall as it was in Savage. It's still there. And the buildings that were at the base of that triangle, I've put in black. I've colored the tip in yellow for a reason, and you will see in a minute, because what we're going to look at from now on is going to show just what happened with that tip of that triangular wall. So here is a magnification of the Olmsted map, which shows clearly that those lines are indeed a wall. And it shows the individual stone work portraying the wall. What is odd about this is that you'll see that an extension of the cemetery has been drawn in on the eastern wall to the right. This was obviously not a part of the original wall. And the word "sem," short for cemetery, has been written in there. What is disconcerting is that penciled inside of the original walls is the letters GR and number 8. And looking at other maps, this is short for a green. So they were penciling in where they were going to put the various greens of the golf course. And this was labeled to be green number 8. So we have the original walls shown clearly as stonework. And we have the extension going out to the east of that eastern wall, and that is labeled cemetery. Now, in 1924, the Bermuda Development Company created a preliminary plan for the Mid-Ocean Golf Club golf course. And that preliminary plan still showed that unique shape, that triangular shape, which had the wall of the original cemetery on the left or the west side, and that sort of slice or sliver that had been added on to the eastern wall is shown there as like a little rectangular sliver, I call it. But it still shows that unique triangular shape. However, by the time of an undated map, a further undated Bermuda Development Company map, it shows only that extension, that strip that was drawn in to the east of the cemetery walls. The original walls have now been erased. They're no longer there. this is essentially what we have now today. Now, Bishop Chauncey Smith, who is now deceased, he recorded in the late 1880s that at the age of 20 years old, he was born in 1910, he attended the burials of two brothers at the old Tuckerstown Cemetery. Jonathan Smith, who was a former trustee of the Marsden Church, and he is my great grandfather, and also he is a common ancestor for Cordell and myself. And his brother, Israel James Smith, who was a former trustee of the Tuckerstown Schoolhouse. Both of these brothers died in 1930 within months of each other. And thanks to the former ombudsman's report and the transcription that she had made of an audio tape of Mr. Chauncey Smith's visit, and we'll go to the next slide, we'll talk about that in the next slide, we have this information. So in his 1989, which is an approximate date, his cemetery visit and interview with Miss Oda Mallory, who was the host of Living Memories radio talk show, she's now deceased, Bishop Chauncey Smith stated, quote, "And I'm almost sure that the Bermuda Development Company built these walls around here because we had no walls to show our outward boundary there," unquote. This visit to the cemetery was videotaped by Mr. Dennis Sherlock, and we are trying to locate a copy of the video, which would shed light on Bishop Smith's gesture. He was gesturing to a particular area where he said there was no wall there to show our outward boundary. He certainly was indicating that the current walls are not original to the cemetery. And we believe that, we're not sure, but he may have been talking about the south wall, which certainly in the Savage maps, there is no south wall shown and no boundary in that direction. Now in 2011, there was a ground penetrating radar survey done by Professor Triggs, Canada, and he produced a report. Now on page 22 of his report, he has a copy of the Savage map of that section that shows the cemetery. And as you can see, he circled the entire triangular shape. And so he acknowledges the Savage map's depiction of the cemetery, but he does not address the obvious anomaly of the difference in size and shape. Dr. Triggs' report acknowledged the following. It was, quote, "unlikely that the walls are original to the cemetery," unquote. One of the buildings depicted on the Savage map to the southwest of the current cemetery boundary may have been the original wooden chapel or schoolhouse. A wall stub, which was found at the southwest corner of the current cemetery, it indicated a wall structure extending towards the south that predated the current walls. And he said that further archaeological excavation would have to be done to determine the extent of that buried wall. In 2012, there was an erasure of all gravestones by our very own Dr. Edward Harris. This picture is depicting that the aftermath of that erasure with members of the Tuckerstown Historical Society, Mr. Keith Dubois, Mr. Danny Richardson, and Mr. Eugene Stovall standing there in consternation. One of them had been called by a passersby, and they were told that they needed to get down to the cemetery right away because it was being destroyed. And they managed to make their way down there and called the Royal Gazette, and hence we have this photograph before it was all cleaned up and regrassed over. All of the gravestone markers, original and contemporary, were destroyed using a large excavating instrument, which they called a backhoe. And these are my words. This is a travesty carried out, it was a travesty carried out in the name of archaeology. So in his 2011 report, Dr. Triggs acknowledged that further archival and archaeological work, which was, quote, beyond the scope, unquote, of his GPR survey, would have to be carried out. Independent research on registered deaths and burials of Tuckerstown residents between 1830 and 1930 by myself, and Mr. Stauble has also done his own independent research as well on this matter. They are unaccounted for. There's between 160 to 200 burials of individuals unaccounted for. And the current cemetery in its size can only accommodate at most a mere 15 to 25 graves. This neglected and desecrated site is crying out for a thorough historical study and for natural justice, finally, for the Tuckerstown community's descendants. And I will end with the full few verses from Habakkuk. Woe to him that coveteth an evil covetousness to his house, that he may set his nest on high. And the Tuckerstown community was a community whose land was coveted by others. Thou hast consulted shame to thy house by cutting off many people, and hast sinned against thy soul. For the stone shall cry out of the wall, and the beam out of the timber shall answer it. Woe to him that buildeth a town with blood, and establisheth a city by iniquity. Thank you.
We certainly want to thank you, Ms. Junis, for that very, very thought-provoking presentation. I'm sure even those of us who know something about Tuckerstown would have learned a great deal from and I'm sure the audience has a lot of questions or maybe some comments. Please put them in the Q&A. There will be time at the end to address those comments or those questions. So once again, Ms. Junis, thank you so much for that presentation. Following on from that presentation, we're going to have another Bermudian to follow on from that, and that is going to be Ms. Arlene Brock. And I will just introduce Ms. Brock so that you will know who she is if you don't already know who she is. She is a 2021 Senior Fellow of the Advanced Leadership Initiative at Harvard University. Her social impact project is executive producing an animated video vignette series for middle schoolers that presents counter narratives to persistent negative stereotypes of Black people. That was a mouthful. Prior professional work includes Bermuda's first national ombudsman, director of the African Ombudsman Research Center, the University of KwaZulu-Natal Law School, Durban, South Africa, mediator, trainer, conflict management, Inc., insolvency litigator, Blake, Castles and Creighton, Toronto and reinsurance litigator at Milligan, White and Smith. And she's also served in Bermuda as voluntary chairs of the Police Complaints Authority and Permanent Labor Arbitration Tribunal. And she's an honorary for a life member of the Caribbean Ombudsman Association. I will now present to you Ms. Arlene Brock.
Thank you very much. Now, first of all, before I even figure out how to share my PowerPoint presentation, I want to thank Ms. Junis and congratulate her on this incredible work you've been doing. My report, A Grave Era, as the Ombudsman for Bermuda, was in 2014, but you have gone well beyond in terms of doing the savage map analysis, as well as getting that recent information of Olmsted Jr.'s maps, and really has opened my eyes, because we couldn't make heads or tails of that triangular shape without the bottom of the triangle on the savage map. And of course, my report and investigation was not really about the maps and the gravesite itself. It was, why was it demolished in 2014? So let me just see, can I share my,
you should be able to, yes.
I should be able to. And what I haven't figured out exactly, and Roger, maybe you can tell me really quickly how to get rid of this bit on the left.
We certainly can see your screen.
Okay, so.
Okay, if you just go up to, if you just hit from beginning, go up to the top.
Okay, there it is,
Yeah.
From beginning. Perfect, thank you very much. So what I'm going to do is very quickly, and then Roger, to just get to the next screen. Am I doing something wrong here?
No, not at all. If you look down on your keypad at the arrows, the one pointing to the right, you should be able to.
Oh, just do it that way?
Yeah,
Perfect.
that would be
Okay.
easy. Yeah.
So I'm going to very quickly run through some of the slides, and they will be available to you after. So I will not go through each of the first set of slides, because I need to get to what my brief is today, which is to actually talk a little bit about laws and principles regarding the preservation of ancient and historic grave sites. But just to know that I came to this a little bit differently. I came to this with respect to an earlier report called Today's Choices, Tomorrow's Cost, and that was regarding development in that entire area. Ms. Jones has shown you that the historic gravesite is on a golf course, and that golf course was within a resort that was created on expropriated land in 1920. And in 2000, gave that same resort an additional special development order to expand its development as a resort. So it's a private company. And during the course of my investigating that issue and whether or not there should have been an environmental impact assessment, I received some testimony from, I think, Ms. Jones and other descendants of the Tuckerstown historic community, complaining that if they're going to do some additional development, couldn't they please do something about the fact that the golf balls are pummeling this ancient historic cemetery from the practice tee above. And as the Ombudsman, I have the right to launch independent investigations, and did so. And during the course of my original EIA, environmental impact assessment investigation, I made a recommendation that, this gravesite has some sort of protection. It's called a historic protection area, but that was really evidenced only by a slight blob on the Bermuda Development Plan map. There was very little in the way of a narrative or story about why it was being protected, who advocated for it to be protected. And I was just concerned and afraid that in the next iteration of the Bermuda Plan map, the little blob would disappear, and with it would disappear the historic protection area. And so I recommended that the government list it as an historic building, which is possible because they were stones, and that having an historic building protection would be an extra layer of protection. Ms. Jones has spoken to you about the visit of Mrs. Oda Mallory along with Bishop Chauncey Smith, who went to that space in 1989. Mrs. Mallory was a very popular talk show host, and someone told her about this grave site. And she said, really? I'd never heard of that. And my husband's family is from Tuckerstown. So she gathered Reverend Chauncey Smith, who I guess was around 70 years old at the time. And they went with the videographer. And I had asked Mr. Sherlock, Ms. Jonas, I do hope you have better luck with Mr. Sherlock to try and find that videotape, because I agree with you that that would be very explicit evidence. But what they did, they went with 2 members of the resort staff, as well as the videographer and Bishop Smith. And you could hear them on the audio counting what they could see. And they said, so there's 9 tombstones. They described it with a gray stone, which is important for later. 2 of them with partial covers. Another 6 that are remnant stones on the surface. And out of all of this, it was growing an excessive amount of vegetation. So excessive that in photographs much earlier on, you couldn't see anything. But apparently between 1962 and 1989, the staff would go in there and cut the lawn, cut the grass down a bit in between the graves. And so Mrs. Mallory and crew were able to see the graves, count them, and she mused in her audio, wouldn't it be nice if they covered over the graves? And wouldn't it be nice if there was some sort of perimeter wall? And she said a nice iron wrought wall gate would make sense here. And in fact, a couple of years later, the staff did that because they also recognized the importance of this place. However, the gate was that triangular extended area that Ms. Jonas referred to a little bit earlier, beyond what the Savage map had said. So it's that extension. So shall we call that the extension part of the cemetery? But that is what was walled in. And in fact, if we go all the way back to 1923, there was an Olmsted map, which we tracked down. I'm so glad you found this additional digitized material from the Library of Congress. But the 1923 map of Olmsted showed only that triangular area as the cemetery, because it touched my heart to see it, that the other area, the original area underneath the triangle, was designated as a green. And therefore that wasn't labeled as the cemetery area, but I now see what has happened there. In any event, the staff basically covered over the sites that the 9 in particular tombstones, but they were very careful and they insisted to me, we did not shave off any part of the original gray stone. What we did was sort of topped it up a bit, enough to be able to hold the concrete slabs. So if you looked at it with your eyes, with your naked eye, even someone who is not an archaeologist and not professional as I am, would have been able to see the original gray stone. Even if you've whitewashed them, you would see that they were a different material. They're a porous material, limestone, different from the concrete slab on top. So when we reach to the point of, here we talk about 1998 with Danny Richardson when he visited the site and he started conversations, but that can come up perhaps in question and answer. But when we get to the 2011 ground penetrating radar survey, the people who had been doing that survey ought to have understood and noticed that however whitewashed the graves were, there were 2 different kinds of stone. There was the actual original Bermuda limestone, porous, and there was the concrete slab. However, the information or the testimony that came to me as ombudsman was that the Bermudian archaeologist, and you've named him, Ms. Junos. I did not name him quite the same way in my report. And you'll notice I have page numbers because as the ombudsman, I really can only speak to you about the evidence that we were able to confirm and put into the report. I could not speak to you about other kinds of evidence that came to us in the course of this investigation. So I was trying to be very careful to stay within the report. But he did tell the media that those covered over, in quotes, reconstructed graves were not in keeping with Bermudian traditional graves. That reconstruction would not have happened if an archaeologist or heritage specialist had been consulted. It would not have been considered the right thing to do. I'm going to come back to that because, in fact, he should have seen, anybody could see that there were two different kinds of stone. But in any event, Dr. Trigg's ground penetrating radar survey then recommended that removal of all above surface, in quotes, new tombs, sarcophagi. And then he said the following statement: if the original grave features have been kept within, they should be preserved, thus taking the cemetery to the place that it would have been prior to the 1920s abandonment. I emphasized the words if and abandonment because it shows that as a Canadian archaeologist, without a historical knowledge of the place and of the situation in 1920, he would have known, had someone told him, that in fact, this Tuckerstown community was not abandoned, they were forced out. And again, I've told you that there shouldn't have been a question of if the original grave features were kept, because they in fact were there. This, so I had made, I will backtrack a second, I had made a recommendation in the environmental impact assessment report that there should have been an extra layer of protection. The government has the due process right to come back and object to any recommendations, to tell me how it's impossible to get done, et cetera, et cetera. They did not do so in this case. They accepted the recommendation and said that this part of my recommendations would have been implemented. And my report was in March, the draft. In October of that year, the grave site was demolished, and you saw the photographs from Ms. Junos of the digging up of those tombstones. And the tombstones weren't even preserved. They were just thrown away. I don't know where they were thrown away. There was no application to the Department of Planning that, may we remove these stones? No, why stones had to be removed. In fact, I was very concerned that Dr. Trigg's terms of reference for the ground penetrating radar survey was to look at subsurface, to try and find subsurface depressions and voids. And yet he made a recommendation about the stones above the surface. So I actually did not think that there was any right by anyone to remove those stones. So I just want to, we've reached the point where it's now demolished. And that was in October 2014, if I'm recalling correctly. And then CURB came to me in the following January to complain that there were plans now to somehow redress this wrong by creating a monument. And CURB felt that it should not just be the original Marsden Methodist Church people or successor congregation and the hotel, but rather the Tuckerstown Historical Society, CURB itself, and other people concerned about heritage in Bermuda should be a part of this, because that original Tuckerstown community that was autonomous, they had their two schools, they had their two churches, they had the Marsden Methodist Church, they later had the what became the African Methodist Episcopal Church. They had their school, their stores, their community life. Relatively autonomous Black community was almost unique in Bermuda. And therefore, what happens there was not just about of importance to Tuckerstown, but to all of Bermuda. So that's how we get to me interfering as ombudsman under the law. I have my own right to launch investigations in the public interest. The parliamentary commissioner in the UK, if many of you are patching in from the UK, does not quite have the same latitude that most of the other 160 ombudsmen around the world have. In the course of doing this entire thing to try and find out what happened, I reached some conclusions, but I also then wanted to find out, so then what do you do? What are the right practices? What are the laws? How do you redress this wrong of having destroyed this place? And what I learned was that coming originally from UK ecclesiastical law, the church really was in control of what happens. And quite often it's actually the local churches that actually decide what happens. But under church law in the UK, the basic principle is the permanence of Christian burial, that once someone is buried, they should not be removed. They should not be exhumed, reinterred to the extent possible. And in fact, there was a relatively recent case in the UK where someone wanted to relocate within her family's plot and family's area in the churchyard and was actually refused permission to do so. For disused grave sites, that is grave sites that have not had burials for 50 years or more, there may be some limited exceptions. And in fact, in the UK, folks saw that when they exhumed the body, or what they felt was the body, pretty much proved of King Richard III. And there's some real questions and concerns about the university doing that without a requisite consultation. But the church law basically says you're permanently buried. Church law also says that you don't actually sell land of burial sites. You just don't do that. And so in that 1920 expropriation of the land from that Black community in Tucker's Town, the act, the 1920 Act number 2, which allowed for the so-called acquisition, but at the end of the day, the process could involve expropriation. They said you may have all of these lands except the AME and Methodist chapels, the Methodist cemetery, the schoolhouse, the cable house, War Department lands and public roads. And so what the company had to do with the AME Church, they effected a sale of the church land. The AME churches in Bermuda, except potentially for one, do not generally have grave sites attached to them. And we pretty much have good evidence. It's in the last remaining witness when I was doing our report. She was 6 years old at the time of 1920. And she pretty much indicated that you went to the AME church in the morning, you went to the Methodist church in the afternoon. Children of the same family would go to both churches. Sometimes your mother was really associated with one, and your father with the other. And so families very much mixed up. So I think we can infer that in fact, people from both churches were buried there. But we do know that the AME church had to have a separate sale. It took 2 or 3 years for various reasons to effect that sale. The Methodist, Wesley Methodist Church did not sell its land in Tucker's Town. It exchanged land for the land not very far away in Harris's Bay. And then they have their own cemetery at the new space. So what we could not find, locate, and believe does not really exist is any kind of conveyance document of the cemetery to the resort. And so in terms of the law around it, there isn't really any law in Bermuda that we can point to, because what happened is that the Methodist Church in 1880, the Methodist Church absolutely prohibited the sale of any kind of cemetery land. However, by 1930, the Methodist Church changed its own rules and said that we can sell cemetery land with the consent of the majority of the congregation. But by 2014, 13 and 14, when I was doing this report, despite the fact that the Marsden Methodist Church had left the Wesleyan Methodist Church for its own theological reasons, there was absolutely no appetite or interest of the Wesleyan Methodist Church to try and make any kinds of claims on that cemetery. So the cemetery remains within the golf course without an owner. But we can say that the descendants of the Wesleyan Methodist Church have a right, the Marsden Church have a right to deal with it, to clean it up, to access it, and so forth. And we go to sort of the US to find what are some of the laws around cemeteries. And in this US, this is very much bound by states. It's often state law that makes these decisions. But generally speaking, there are rights of access. And some states may allow a church with a cemetery or owners of the land where a cemetery, historic cemetery is located. They may say, you can come here once a month on such and such a prescribed date, or you may come only once a year, but you have a right of access if you are descendants of the people buried there. There's another right, which is the right of further burials. And for historic cemeteries, that is not the case. Then there's the right against desecration. And with the rights against desecration, a UK court had said that monuments on top of the ground belong to the descendants or are the rights of the descendants, even though the land itself may be owned by an individual church property owner. So the right of desecration is for the living. And then there are rights to relocate cemeteries in the public interest. And of course, we've seen that more recently, I think, with the African burial ground, which I'm going to come to in a minute, with respect to relocation. So instead of laws, I can point to you best practices. And in best practices, I had to, in the course of my report, to try and cull together practices from another places. One of the things we did, if you looked at the report, and you'll see that one of the things we tried to do is to see, was there a best practice at any other gravesite in Bermuda? Then we looked at, what about other grave sites within golf courses elsewhere in the world? And then we had the good fortune at the time we were doing the report, was that someone from the Commonwealth War Graves Commission was in Bermuda to inspect the war graves in Bermuda. And this organization has had more than a century of developing principles and good practice for grave sites that are meant to be historic. And we actually know a lot about that gentleman. But the general rule is you try to avoid any kind of invasive action. You try and keep things as they are. You try and preserve that Christian ethic of keeping people buried where they are buried. And I must say that there's a recent recent consultations in the UK about the need to pull together the various church and common law principles around cemeteries and to actually push for law reform, because Wales and Scotland and England, they all have somewhat slightly different things. There's all the local jurisdictions that have their own slightly different rules, and then there's some common law cases. And so there is a move right now to actually have some law reform and bring some clarity and some consolidation of these thoughts. I'm going to finish in just a moment. I think my time is about up, but let me just point out to you sort of the 5 increasingly progressive kinds of steps that people should take and that we recommended in our report that Bermuda should consider when it's looking at the Tuckerstown gravesite. The very first thing you do is mark the borders. And so I'm so delighted that Ms. Junos has I think, is well on the way to giving exquisite proof that the borders are larger than that triangle that she spoke about earlier. So if we can figure out a way to mark the borders of the Tuckerstown Cemetery, that would be the first thing. Then the next principle is commemorate each known soul. Now, we do not know who's all buried there, but we do know some people. Reverend Bishop Smith talked about his two brothers. In the interview with the last remaining resident, she talked about her stepfather and actually pointed us exactly where he was buried. And so we do know some of the known souls. Ms. Junos, it looks like, has done a great deal of work about the people who lived and died during these time periods that the cemetery was there. And so there may be other names that can be identified, or at least can be inferred as people who are likely to be buried there. Because Ms. Junos, I think you also did research on who would have been buried at a church not far from there, an Anglican church in a bit further from Tuckerstown, but that some people would have been buried there. So I think you're able to begin that identification process so that we can have a sense of how do we commemorate each known soul. Where we have to, there are instances in the world where cemeteries are restored, and to the extent that you can restore this one, you know where it's located, restore it, or sometimes replace in that spot. We give examples in the report of a golf course, for example, a gravesite on a golf course. They have absolutely no idea exactly where the tombs are. There are no markers, there's nothing, there's no stone, but they know it was, according to local legend, in that area, and the golf course has taken steps to preserve at least that area. They can't replace it, but there are other instances where there's replacement. And when it is impossible to commemorate the known souls, then you do some sort of memorialization. And in the very absolute last resort, you avoid it at all costs. But if you've already built buildings on top of Wall Street, you've already built roadways, then you should see about exhuming and relocating the people who are buried there. Ms. Junos has already talked about the importance, so I won't revisit that. And she's already gone to the scriptures, so I won't revisit that. But my recommendations in a grave era were consult, reconstruct, and tell the story, because I think the story of the original 1920 expropriation, no, before that, the story of the 1800s community should be told, the 1920s expropriation should be told, and the demolishment of the graves in the 2014 should be told. And I want to end on 2 points. One is that Canada, you may have heard, has recently discovered some unmarked graves at least 2 residential schools, one in British Columbia, over 200 people, and the other in Saskatchewan, the same ground penetrating radar methods. These are not mass graves. And so in fact, in both of those places, they are able to point out exactly where the graves are, how uniform they are, etc. It would appear that most of the people buried would be children who were extremely abused in the residential schools for Indian, Native, Indigenous children. And one of the things that they've said in Saskatchewan is, we know the boundaries, so we can do the boundaries. What they've now done is they've marked each grave with a little flag. And then they're now in the process of trying to commemorate each soul by affixing names. They may not be able to affix the right name to the right area or tomb, but what they can do, or grave, what they can do is they can find out what children disappeared and died, Native, Indigenous children, in those periods, and assume some of the names for that. And then after that process, or they are going to be building a monument to memorialize. So they are obviously consulting with professionals, but they are going through those steps that we had talked about in the slide before. And finally, I want to say, during the course of the investigation, I kept trying to get someone to answer why. Why was it necessary to dig up all of the tombs? If you wanted to find out if there were potential bones or remains, dig one of them up. Get the permission, do the consultation, and if everyone agrees, do one. But why did you have to do all 15? And why did you then have to send the following email from Dr. Harris to Tucker's Point Resort? Thanks for meeting at the site yesterday. The men did a great job, and I would like to suggest that the areas worked on be covered with soil and grass plugs as soon as possible so that the cemetery looks neat and tidy. I do not have evidence, and as an ombudsman, I cannot ascribe particular intentions to anybody. But I do find it a concern that there is a thought that this should be done as quickly as possible. These people, this community has been there for 150, 200 years or more, as the Savage map indicated. And they should have had the respect of time and consultation. Someone told me, a couple of people told me during the course of the investigation, because nothing in our reports is written unless we can find at least two credible sources. But it is in the nature of archaeology to break things down, to try and find out what's going on, what are the composite pieces of the archaeological problem. And with all due respect to any archaeologists on this call, I want to say that such decisions should not be made by archaeologists alone. Decisions to destroy heritage should not be made by experts or bureaucrats alone. They must include the entire heritage community, especially in the case of Bermuda, where that one community was so unique and had an impact and importance for the entire island. Thank you very much for allowing me, even if I end on this hopefully not too disrespectful note to your profession. Thank you.
And thank you very much, Ms. Brock. Again, a very thought-provoking and complimentary presentation that I think for those of us in Bermuda will provide impetus to really get a proper solution to the desecration of those graves. And I know the listening audience, you probably have your plate full by now, but I'm going to ask you to just make some more room because we've got some other speakers and they're going to weigh in on this. We've got some very distinguished speakers. I'm going to introduce them now, and then I'm going to ask them 2 questions, and then they're going to speak to this topic from an international perspective. So let me just bring up their bios so that I can read them to you. And then I'm going to ask some questions. So without in any proper order, how it is on my screen. The first is Professor Rui Gomes Coelho. He is an historical archaeologist who works on colonialism, decolonization, conflict and resistance in Southern Europe and in the Atlantic world. Rui is affiliated with the Center for Archaeology at the University of Lisbon, Portugal. His interests are driven by a fascination with the sensorial constitution of alternative modernities and with marginal communities who mobilize material culture against traditional approaches to heritage. Recent publications include an archaeology of decolonization, imperial intimacies in contemporary Lisbon. So Professor Rui Gomes Coelho. I hope I'm pronouncing that right. We have Coelhos in Bermuda. Also with us is Dr. Whitney Battle-Baptiste. Dr. Baptiste is a professor in the Department of Anthropology and director of the W.E.B. Du Bois Center, both at University Mass Amherst. A native of the Bronx, Dr. Battle-Baptiste is a scholar and activist who sees the classroom and the campus as a space to engage contemporary issues with a sensibility of the past. Her research critically engages the interconnectedness of race, gender, class, and sexuality through an archaeological lens. She has worked on Andrew Jackson's Hermitage Plantation, the ABL Smith School on Beacon Hill in Boston, the W.E.B. Du Bois home site or House of the Black Burgharts in Great Barrington, Massachusetts. Dr. Whitney Battle Baptiste. And last but not least, we have Dr. Michael Blakey. Professor Blakey is extensive research, covers bioarchaeology, publicly engaged archaeology, and scientific racism. He was scientific director of the New York African Burial Ground Project and published in 2009 with Leslie Rankin Hill, The Skeletal Biology of New York African Burial Ground. He began the Remembering Slavery, Resistance, and Freedom Project, sponsored by the Virginia General Assembly. Currently, National Endowment of the Humanities Professor at William and Mary. Blakely has had professorships at Spelman College, Columbia Brown, La Spezia, he can correct that for me, and Howard University, where he founded the W. Montague Cobb Biological Anthropology Laboratory. Quite a mouthful there. So these are our presenters, and I'm going to just ask them 2 questions, and I'm going to have Professor Blakely weigh in first, then Professor Baptiste, and then Dr. Coelho. And the questions I'm going to put to our presenters are simply this: what are your similar or not experiences around sites of memory or knowledge of cases that are similar to Tucker's Town? That's the first question. And the second question is, what is considered best practice for this kind of case? And do you have any recommendations for us here in Bermuda? So I'm going to again turn it over to Professor Blakey.
Thank you very much, Mr. Riley. May I in some way join the answers to those 2 questions? Would that be all right? I make one answer, short relatively. So having had an opportunity to think about cemeteries, burial grounds, nationally and internationally, and worked with many descendant communities over the years, and as an anthropologist, one way to sort of encapsulate the meaning of cemeteries beyond even their specific religious meanings is that they're emblematic of human dignity. Now, however we that's a big word, dignity. They're emblematic of humanity, have been since the beginning of our species. Burial of the dead, funerary treatment is something that begins with archaic Homo sapiens. No other species of animal does it, and we all something. The usage, tools, technology, fire, food sharing. It marks us as humans. And it may be, in the archaeological record, the earliest symbolic communication. It is a symbol of something. I'm calling it dignity. And what is powerfully good, if dignity is that, is dialectically amenable to its opposite. Take the Iliad and Achilles, desecration of the body of the prince of Troy. That whole discussion, if you look at it carefully, what the gods, even of the Greeks, had to say about this, and so on. The fact that the king of Troy would go to such ends to get his son's body back. What species does this? But Homer understood, I suppose, as many others have. I look at Masters of the Dew, Jacques Roman. There are many uses of burials. understands this essence of humanity and human dignity that's being fought for and against with the bones of the dead. So I worked 30 years ago and for a dozen years on the New York African Burial Ground. Let me say that this 18th century cemetery for enslaved Africans in New York was for them a major institution because their humanity was absolutely contested by Europeans who were creating a narrative that they were not humans, they were property. And desecrated their humanity in every way possible, not in every way because they would make it, these Africans would make it impossible, but they had to struggle over that. And the establishment of a cemetery may have been their first institution where they could assert their human dignity. And so the English and the Dutch used it as a dump. We see kiln wasters from the adjacent pottery, waste from the tannery. This is also all symbolic about racism and slavery in all other aspects of colonial life. It's a little, the cemetery is a very hot encapsulation of other things. And that continued in the 1990s as the federal government essentially sought to desecrate, disrespected those graves and the descendant community's right to them. One of the things one sees, I think, throughout humankind is that the descendants have or need the right to determine the disposition of their ancestral remains. And I would just add to Ms. Brock one thing, yes, the municipalities are required, but the descendants are the ones who have ethical rights to determine the disposition of those remains. And we should have no problem with saying that, you know? And I'll get to why in just a moment. So we created a clientage model that's after the notion of informed consent, in a nutshell. As the whole Black community protested around this site and insisted that it would be treated properly, we joined them as scholars and established a new way of doing archaeology in which one must ask permission of descendant communities if you want to touch a bone. The Native American Graves Protection and Repatriation Act had established that a year before the African Burial Ground. And it took them a long time to get that, to establish that it is they're the descendants who have the right to determine the disposition of human remains. I saw something on the Society of American Archaeology recently that involved too many stakeholders, but in the end, if the descendants determine what the other stakeholders will do, you can make it work. You need to be explicit about who should be in charge, whose life, whose memory, whose history, whose dignity these remains represent. Not everyone's. Everyone's not an equal stakeholder. Everyone doesn't have equal rights to everything. This is my assertion. Your community descendant came to control that site well enough through enormous political effort and political power. I'm just going to follow up to the present. The National Trust for Historic Preservation has established that descendant communities have at least equal say in the interpretation of museum and historic sites like presidential sites, in the interpretation, and that they put slavery in the center of the American story, and that descendants are equally involved in determining what that memory will be. So this goes from this sort of a very old form of memory, burials, to all kinds of interpretations of the past that are stolen, and we're talking about racism. White supremacy has sought to, in that essence, not only take the money of the people, their labor, but to steal their honor as well by creating a story about what happened in which the theft never took place, in which the dishonors never occurred, that are actually dishonors to white people, to Europeans. who enslaved others. So they're saying we need descendant communities to be empowered. In most of these cases, the way I work with Native communities as well, who are descendant communities, Black people who are not inclined towards marginalizing their ancestors' role in the creation of the United States, or dismissing the abuse that their ancestors survived in order to paint a prettier picture of white America, which is what, talking about archaeologists, this is what many of my colleagues are involved in doing and in history, whether they are Euro-American, whether they're aware of it or not. Not all, but these are, if we're anthropologists, we understand that culture exists, society exists. It's not just about individuals. There are trends, and racism is one of them. And it operates in archaeology and history. And finally, but this is a great thing because James Madison's Montpelier has just, by an effort that reminds me so much of New York and the African burial ground, great, shrewd, dedicated political activity, the descendant community has now achieved an agreement with the board to structural parity. And this is going to start to percolate throughout the preservation community. So the final thing, though, is I think cemeteries are often, as I say, emblematic. And I think there's this sort of, I have this idea that if you can't control your own story about the past, what do you control? And I'm afraid what I'm hearing, and I could be wrong because I'm coming into this Black Bermuda, it's a wonderful place. I'd actually worked with that on a couple of remains from Smith Fort for the Maritime Museum, so I'll tell you that at my institute. But I don't know the terrain very well. But what I'm hearing is, it has me ask the question, do white people control Black Bermudans? Because that seems to be the essence of the problem spoken of in the language of memorial here. Why don't you fix it? If not, I think you're talking about a hindrance. What is the larger hindrance of which Tuckerstown, much less the cemetery, is emblematic? Thank you.
Thank you, Professor Blakely. Again, food for thought there. Thank you for underlying the fact that it is the ancestors who have a say in what happens to their ancestral grave. Again, helping us to reinvigorate this fight, and certainly asking that very profound question: do whites control Black Bermudians or thereabouts? So I'm going to now ask Dr. Battle Baptiste to weigh in on the issue of memory sites.
Thank you for inviting me. I'm very new to this story and this site, but I appreciate following someone who I would consider a mentor, even if Dr. Blakey doesn't acknowledge it, but he's one of my mentors. But also a good friend, Rui, as well here. I wanted to start out, Dr. Blakey talked about dignity. I actually wanted to talk about the value of human life, because for me, thinking critically about not just the erasure of a cemetery, but the inability for folks to access their ancestors and the spaces in which their dead are buried, to me is not just a problem or potentially is not just a problem in Bermuda, but it's also a problem throughout the Southern United States. Myself as a granddaughter of the Great Migration, my family all came from the South in North Carolina. I have only been to my ancestors on one side grave area once in my life, and it was extremely hard to get to. We still have quote unquote access, right? But the vegetation is so overgrown. There is no more road. We don't own the land, but our people are there. And so for me, I think what I want to comment today is in my own experience, and my suggestions are to understand that without that value, without understanding, having that access, we can't continue to share with our youth and our young our stories. And this is not okay. And I appreciate Ms. Brock, thank you so much and there is no disrespect taken, because archaeologists, and dare I say, bureaucrats making decisions, to me is scary, because part of the reason why I value the field of archaeology, but I understand the dangers of archaeology. I understand the dangers of being an expert in someone else's culture and history, and how, and for example, I've done work on the Bahamian island of Eleuthera, and where I've worked for a couple of years with a community. I mentored and advised one of my PhD students who did her dissertation on a site in Eleuthera, or on Eleuthera, on island. And she is an archaeologist, but did not excavate. The mythology that archaeologists have to excavate, to me, is something from the past. I think that the irony is that a lot of the archaeology of the diaspora, African diaspora, the archaeology of slavery, the archaeology and the anthropology and the history of these, the trade, from the trade to the life to emancipation and abolition, all of that is a past that is not past. We are still living with the implications of slavery, of the institution, and of the mythology that we are free, right? So the view of human life is something we seem to be, especially in the US right now, we seem to be fighting for our humanity. And it wasn't, when I went to the Bahamas, I had a very different interaction with my colleagues that I worked with in the Bahamas. And I'll tell you why. Because as the only woman of African descent on the team, when I got there, the assumption was that, I was going to be, I don't know, an insider because I'm African American. Well, I am not Bahamian American, I'm African American. And to be honest, I'm of Jamaican descent. So, and my husband is Haitian. The idea that I would go to an island and assume that I know the culture, the history, the practice, all kinds of things, was something that I never went with, because I understand I cannot go into a place that is not where I'm from and dictate as expert. The expert to me is the person who is living the life of the area, of the space, of the site, of the country. And for me, that was not an eye opener. I mean, I went down there understanding that I did not know what slavery looked like in the Bahamas. And on this island in particular, we were engaging with a battle, a fight between the descendants who were given the property from slavery, from before emancipation, were given the property, and the government who called it abandoned, because the idea was that they wanted it probably was a golf course, but it was resorts. It was trying, and unfortunately, it was another Bahamian trying to take the land from the community that had owned it. The idea of abandonment really stuck out to me, because it's interesting, because the land is not used commercially, because folks are cultivating the land as they need, right? It is not seen as the same type of agricultural practice as is happening in the US or other parts of or other parts of the world. So this is the argument of abandonment. It is not used. Abandonment means that, and for this particular area, you're talking about the Bahamas, which has several islands. So folks are gonna go where tourism is. And Eleuthera is not the place for that, right? It's an outer island, family island. It's not the main islands. So this idea of abandonment, you don't grow more, there's no commercial farming. So this idea of abandonment literally had to be fought between Bahamian and Bahamian. And for me, as someone from the United States, it wasn't shocking to me. It was actually, to me, I could see the threads of colonialism flowing throughout, and slavery to that matter, flowing throughout, that are connecting these islands, connecting these spaces, these places in which daughters and sons of the African diaspora continue to live. We have to have access to our dead, to our ancestors. It is something that I feel very strongly about. But for me, that value of human life is in the present, but that doesn't mean that doesn't include our ancestors. And as an archaeologist, I do not bite my tongue, as Dr. Blakey could attest to. I do not bite my tongue when it comes to letting folks of European descent know that you are not the lead in this investigation, and for you to make a decision without consultation, to me, is harboring on unethical. And I'm saying that because those who are buried, if at all possible, as Ms. Brock said, should stay buried. There is no reason to debate how movement is the option to keep people where they are, but also not just keeping them where they are, to have access for contemporary communities to know where their loved ones are, even if they don't know the names, even if they don't know exactly who is where. As Ms. Brock talked about the residential schools and the kind of trauma that this is bringing up for communities who did not know where their dead were. And unlike indigenous culture and practice, their bones, the bones of their ancestors, are still living. They consider them a part of their families. So to be disconnected is extremely painful. However, I want to argue that although we might not have the same exact idea of those bones of our ancestors, we know when we call the names, right? We know when we rename a child of an ancestor you knew. We might do little things like keeping food, a little bit of food on your plate. I'm not going to get into all of the little rituals that we do as African Americans, as Caribbean Americans, or Caribbean folks, sorry, in Bermuda. But the truth is that archaeologists should be in a position to be able to recognize, to be able to see, and to help celebrate the ancestral knowledge that is around. And I don't want to keep going on, but I just want to say that particularly in my practice and how I train my students, I encourage them to think more broadly about what archaeology is, and appreciating that archaeology is both excavating, but it's also the materiality of our lives. It's the stuff of our lives. It's the buildings or where their buildings were. It doesn't mean that we have to excavate, because once we excavate, we destroy. And the one thing that I would end with in conjunction with Dr. Blakey is that dignity is a part of where we need to look for our future, as well as understanding that the struggle for the value of our lives, the value of African folk, is not simply in saying that you recognize that we are people now and that Black Lives Matter now. It is understanding that our ancestors matter as well. And without them, we would not be here, and it's their shoulders we stand on. So I thank you for inviting me, and I thank you for my little 2 cents or maybe 3 cents that I put in. So thank you so much.
Thank you so much, Dr. Battle Baptiste. We appreciate your contribution. Yes, we do need access, and that we do value our ancestors as part of us. So we thank you so much for your contribution. I hope you still got room on your plate, folks, because we got one more piece to put on your plate. And I'm sorry, Dr. Coelho, I know it's going past midnight in Paris, but I'm glad you're still with us. And so we're going to bring Dr. Coelho up, and he's going to give us a perspective as well. Over to you.
Hi, good evening. Thank you quite a lot about Bermuda and about your community, and also continuing to learn with Michael Blakey and with Dr. Baptiste, with whom I've been learning a lot through the years. I really appreciate, and I apologize again, my connection is a bit unstable, so I apologize if there are any glitches, and I'm very sorry about that. I really appreciate Arlene Brock word about archaeology, and they really resonate with me as an archaeologist and as an instructor of future archaeologists as well. I am very aware that archaeology is being traditionally used, and it emerged first as a discipline that was used to concur with and help empire being constructed, not empire, not just outside of Europe, but within continues to be in many. I wonder if you hear me. Are you able to hear me? Yes. Okay. And it continues to be so. And archaeology, like many other colonial white supremacist tools, is an activity that extracts. It was built to extract. So this idea of going through the earth to extract things, to study, to classify, this is very much akin to the plantation, the work of the plantation, or the work that white people did over Black bodies and continues to do over Black bodies as workers and as citizens, right? And this is something that we really have to think of as archaeologists, especially white archaeologists, as we are working in contexts such as this. So this is one of the reasons, one of the many reasons why, as an archaeologist, what I really do is always about the present. It's never really about the past, and it's never really about anything that I might find that might help me say something about the past or the present. It's really about the present, and it's really about the only question that matters for me, and I believe for everyone who's here, which is what kind of society do we want? What do we want archaeology to do in our society, and how do we want our society to be as, a society that has something somehow to do with archaeology as a practice. And so how can we really answer to that, and how work deal with that somehow? Everything that I do has to do to deal with the present. I don't work about the African diaspora. I learn with the African diasporic experiences to help me understand how we, especially white people, might think of alternatives for the world that we have today. And of course, the African diasporic experiences were revolutionary in many ways. And the African diaspora has really shaped the alternatives that when we think about alternatives to the contemporary world, in terms of a global capitalist system that continues to exploit people. The African diaspora really brought up, many alternatives, starting with Haiti in the late 18th century, in the early 19th century, which is something that we really quite forgot very often. And this really helps me connect to other experiences that I also work with. For example, in the former Yugoslavia, where I'm currently working, I'll be going there this summer to work on partisan resistance against Nazism during the Second World War, where, again, like Emile Césaire was, when he was writing, this Martinican, French Martinican writer, when he was thinking about fascism and Nazism in Europe in the Second World War, he was thinking of colonialism being brought back home. So it was the work of colonialism that was, in the end, was eating Europe. It was eating the metropolitans themselves. And it was all part of the same. So how can we think of, I think of archaeology as a tool that helps me assemble these experiences of resistance, these experiences that shape alternatives, that help us think of alternatives, and to think of a different future, like Whitney was telling us about. And the experience of that and dealing with loss and all that is really probably one of the most powerful experiences that we all deal with. And as Dr. Blakey was just telling us about these ideas of dignity, what makes us human, and so on. And in this sense, it will probably be interesting to think of, probably as I am thinking of all these different experiences that shape my idea of what is resisting, or what we are going through today, and the kind of world that we are trying to shape for in the future. When I think about all of these, I can only see some of the most powerful experiences I have gone through. One of them is the celebration of this village in Croatia that has to do with the partisans of the Second World War that all assemble, not in the day that the village was liberated after the war, but the day that the village was bombed and a lot of people were killed. So the villagers assemble first in the church, and then they assemble in the burial grounds where the victims of this disaster happened to be buried. And the same has happened to me in other places in the Americas, in Brazil, for example, where people go exactly to celebrate their ancestors. And they all, some idea that tradition of the ancestors, we are also thinking of something better that will come tomorrow, that will shape our future. So I would like to think of these burial grounds and these burial sites as opportunities for us to think of action, and action not just future oriented, but action in the present that is oriented towards very specific concrete goals in the present. And that way, I will just give you two examples that I'm more familiar with because they are connected to the places where I work. The first one would be in Brazil, a place called Rio dos Pretos Novos, which was a place in Rio de Janeiro where, well, just to contextualize, Brazil was the final destination of about half people were enslaved along the African coasts between the 16th and the 19th centuries. About half of them went to Brazil, and a large portion of these people were sent to Rio de Janeiro. So Rio de Janeiro was a major hub in the Atlantic world during the slave trade, and a lot of these people, after the Middle Passage, they would be so weak that they would, die very soon afterwards. So what the slavers would do is just dump these people in mass graves, and well, let's just call it like that. It's an euphemism in this context, and a mass grave, to call it a mass grave. And these people will be deposited, and they would eventually be forgotten during the plans of expansion of Rio and development of Rio, a modern city in the 19th century, in the 20th century. What happened in the late 1990s was that as people were, developing houses in the center of Rio de Janeiro, they end up finding human remains, and just in their backyard or within their own homes. And this was really the catalyst for people to be, to start thinking about, what really is going on here. Who did these human remains belong to? And in the 1990s, when this happened, the Brazilian society at that point was not really awakened to this, except for, of course, the African Brazilian communities, which are basically more than half of Brazil. But for the elites, this was not something that really they cared much about. It was only in the much later, about 10 years later, that the Brazilian society that had shifted completely in a completely different direction. There was a left wing of very different from what we have today, and there was more. There were more attempts at trying to democratize society in the sense that there will be some form of public sphere when it comes to the contributions of Black Brazilians and white Brazilians and so on. So it was at that moment that people realized that there should be something happening around this. So towards the end of the, not many years ago, they end up opening a memorial that was connected to some archaeological work that built visibility to what happened in that former mass grave, which was a huge territory that is now completely covered by the modern city. And these, together with the rediscovery of a wharf, also in Rio, that was connected to basically the disembarkment of enslaved people all the way down to the 19th century, really brought up, a completely different understanding of what was this difficult past of the slavery and the aftermath of slavery that continued to linger over Brazilian society. And this was really the catalyst for many actions that start happening in the late 2010s and that continue to happen. And that, basically bringing Black activists and their allies up to the streets to challenge governmental decisions and so on. This is something that would be compared unimaginable, let's say 20 years ago, but now it's really possible because there are people bringing it up to the streets, and archaeology, in a way or another, is part of that conversation. Of course, this is not to not forget that there were many martyrs along the way. One of them was Marielle Franco, who was a Brazilian Black activist who was murdered just a few years ago, precisely around the time when this whole process about the hereticization was being built up to the public sphere, that ended up also in the registration of the wharf as World Heritage by UNESCO. So this is really a very complex process, but that helps, and the people, society at large, both Black and white people, all sorts of people, to think critically about how complex society is. Another case that I would also bring up for you to consider, archaeologists, recently, 2009, that was found by archaeologists in the south of Portugal in a town called Lagos, which was one of the harbors where it is documented that first group of enslaved Africans came in the 15th century. So they were disembarked in this town, and they were eventually, this was described in probably one of the most emotional descriptions of the slave trades in the 15th century. And in 2009, in this town, as people were preparing to open a golf course, but unlike in Bermuda, it's a mini golf course. It's not an actual golf course. They start digging the area to build a parking lot, and they found again, and to use an euphemism, a mass grave, and a mass grave that people understood to be a mass grave of enslaved Africans. There were some people, as they were being basically dumped on the ground. This, of course, this generated huge commotion in the society, especially among people of African descent. But again, it took many, many years for people to take these critically and for them to use these critically as they act in the public sphere. And again, there was a memorial that was built without any consultation with communities of African descent in Portugal. As you can imagine, there are many Black people in Portugal, so it is not really because they could not find associations or organizations they could talk to. It's really they just did not think about this. So the memorial was built with, let's say, there was a good intention of bringing some visibility to what happened with the institution of slavery in this region. But in the end, it was still very much like a white narrative. So, but in around 2017, 2018, something very important happened, which was a trip organized by, or an individual trip of several activists of African descent to travel to this town and saw one like this. This is not the story that we want to tell. So they went back to Lisbon and they started the whole different process, which ended in the approval for the construction of the first memorial built in Lisbon, the city capital of Portugal, which was again one of the main slave trade centers of Europe until the 18th century. So this of course is connected to a whole discussion in the public sphere about racism, about structural racism, and about how people about the society that we want. Conversation that again started or was complexified with these archaeological finds that the archaeologists did in the south of Portugal. So the reason why I'm bringing all this up here, and I promise I'll just shut up very soon, very briefly, is that archaeology, despite all these contradictions that archaeology emerged as a tool of white supremacy, archaeology can still be the tool that will help us think of our societies critically, and not basically to study people, not to study the past, but to provide opportunities for us to act together and to think of a different future, and basically imagine a society in which we are all proud of being. And I'll just stop here. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Dr. Coelho, certainly for giving us particular insight into something that that perhaps many of us didn't know with regards to burial sites. One of the questions that you did ask at the very beginning, is what does, well, one of the things you stated was that archaeology helps us to understand. And once we understand, then the question is, what is it that we must do? And when you was talking, I was thinking about a puzzle, and you're putting together, say, 1,000-piece puzzle. You don't have to have all the 1,000 pieces in places for you to get a clear indication of where the puzzle's going. And I think what Ms. Jonas presented was more pieces to that puzzle now, and we can see where it's going. So the question that once we understand what should we do, I think the way forward is quite clear. I do apologize to the audience for going over. We have such a distinguished panel. I thought it best to allow them to speak because we do not always get the opportunity to have local experts and then international experts weigh in together. And so without any further ado, again, thank you all of the panelists. There are, I see 13 questions in the Q&A, so I'm going to go to those questions, and particularly Dr. Coelho, if you can hang on for a few more minutes. Now, I know it's gone past almost 12:30 now there, so I'm conscious of your time, so I just wanted to get to these questions, and if you do have to sign off, then please do. We won't stay too much longer, but I do want to get to some of the questions. So the first, well, I don't know how they came in, so I'm just going to go through them. Is there any way of funding Ms. Junis to continue her work on the Tuckerstown Free Black Cemetery? That was a question that came up in my mind too, because she clearly has done a lot of research there. So that's something that we can certainly look into. Do you want to weigh in, Ms. Junis?
I'm on.
Yeah, I can hear you.
Hear me? Oh, I'm sorry. Raj is doing this for me. Well, I'm humbled that someone would make a suggestion like that, and I would just love to do as much research as possible. I'm very passionate about it, and I really want to get to the truth. So I would be honored to be given that opportunity, really.
Well, that is part of the way forward, getting the rest of the pieces of the puzzle. Okay, let's see. Forgive me, I missed it, but who commissioned or paid for Dr. Triggs' report? That will be for you, Ms. Brock.
So my understanding of the evidence that I received was that this was through Dr. Harris, Bermuda's premier archaeologist, and also I believe he got the agreement of the Marsden Cemetery, who relied on him as an expert. And then the resort administrators at the time, management at the time, recognizing that this was a hot topic, deferred also to the Marsden Church community and Dr. Harris. So I'm not sure who paid for it, but I think there was some contribution from the resort and possibly from Commissioner's House, but I'm not certain.
Okay, thank you so much. Okay, thank you, Dr. Blakey. Dr. Blakey has to sign off.
I'm so sorry. I have to talk with a group of descendants in Virginia. It's been a real pleasure.
Thank you so much.
Learned a lot.
For joining us.
Bye.
Thank you. Thank you so much. We're honored to have you.
One of the questions again is, what could a restorative justice outcome look like, obviously from the descendants' point of view? The principles of restorative justice refer to emotional impact, which here would go even beyond, far beyond the ombudsman's recommendation. So I guess that could partially be for CURB, who we do the work in restorative justice. Any one on that, a restorative justice outcome. Well, what would that look like? Any of the panelists? Well, then I'll tackle that one. If we were to have a restorative approach from a descendant's perspective, a restorative justice, a restorative approach seeks to heal and to right wrongs, and so the wrong is very much there before us. I think it was Dr. Baptiste mentioned about having this access, and I recall being having a descendant there and knowing about the cemetery for some time, the access was always a problem because, first of all, you're talking about Tuckerstown, an area that was taken away from a predominantly Black people, and then became this sort of, if you will, a gated community where you felt that you couldn't even go down there. So, for a while, I didn't even know where the cemetery was. I knew it was there, but it was an area where you would be, you see these signs all over Bermuda, trespassers will be persecuted. And so they're very much there, largely by Europeans. You have these signs that basically says to stay out. And so you get that ingrained. So I think a restorative approach from the descendants perspective will very much look to first the restoration of the grave based on some of the recommendations given by the panelists, and they probably would have more ideas because it would be one of the few opportunities that they would have been given that opportunity to say what it is that how they feel about it and what they would like to be made whole. Because at the end of a restorative process, you ask the question, what can be done to make you whole? And so you would have that opportunity. And again, once you have that information, the question, as Dr. Cahillo pointed out, is then what do you do?
Cordell, I just wanted to follow up on that because I had written it down, but I got distracted. The process of healing is extremely important because that access, that the ability to be in the space where your ancestors are, but also not having those signs alert you and constantly reminding you that you are not, your movement is restricted on a place of where you were born. Like that to me, or where you're from is something that is an amazing, is the wrong. How do you write that? How do you have to then open it up again for young people to begin to see pathways in, but also provide the opportunity of exchange for young people and elders, because that connection, it leads, helps to, it helps in the healing process. And I think that restorative justice, like you said, healing is a major part of it. And as Rui was just talking about, the idea of archaeology of the contemporary being a tool for which people can even explore the idea of healing because they didn't know, or because they, like in the residential schools, they didn't know where their loved ones were, or in the case of the example I used in North Carolina, or in this case, Tuckerstown, the idea of access, the idea of being able to be in that space, which to me in many ways is sacred in itself. But to have that restricted by signs, by golf courses, by holes, I think holes on golf courses, I don't play golf, so I don't know what it's called. But those kinds of things, I think that archaeology, it can be understood as a tool for healing, not the way to healing, but just a tool among the many, is important. That archaeology should not be at the top of the list of how we right the wrongs.
Thank you so much.
Cordell?
Yes.
If I could just share something. The community has made this whole issue invisible. And I'll give you one example. Recently, well, in the last, in 2014, the National Trust, the Bermuda National Trust, which is the icon in Bermuda of preserving heritage, if such an organization sees you as invisible, what message does that send? They produced in 2014 a book it's a teacher's resource guide, and it's an introduction to Bermuda's historic cemeteries. Tuckerstown is invisible, it's not mentioned. They have a map that shows where all the historic cemeteries are. And in the Turkestown area, there is nothing. The National Trust knows about the cemetery. They knew about it. How can they produce a teacher's resource guide and the Turkestown Cemetery doesn't exist? That sends a message. It sends a message to us as adults. It sends a message to children. It sends a message to teachers. It's not important. And these are the types of redress that we need. I mean, I don't know how to address that, but we certainly need an apology. We need an acknowledgement that we have been deliberately made invisible. And so, you know, this is just an example that I wanted to give of how, you know, the iconic institutions in our society don't want to talk about this.
Just note that that's quite incredible because the National Trust absolutely knows that this cemetery exists.
Oh yes, I was shocked myself.
Just one other thing also is that part of the original complaint to me was that the golf balls were pummeling into the cemetery. Now, there's one that we mentioned in the US in the report where if golf balls go in, too bad, they're just lost. People can't go running in after them to retrieve them, which is what they used to do in Bermuda. But the issue is that the practice tee is on a slope, on a hill just above. And so no matter what happens, you can put, you know, hedges 40 miles high, maybe not miles, but you can put hedges and so forth, but they're still going to get there. So one of the things that people had wanted at the time that I did the report in 2014 was, I think it was Turkestown Historical Society, actually, Ms. Jonas argued that they should just redesign the golf course and remove that practice tee. And at the time, they had just set it up relatively recently. And so it is about time for the golf course to, in fact, be redesigned. And so one of the recommendations in the report is that in the redesign, they need to take that into account. We gave an example, again, of a cemetery in a golf course elsewhere in the States, where they designed the golf course around the area that was alleged to be a burial ground. And they actually had a bench there so that golfers could sit and contemplate where they were and really respect the space within which they were having their leisure activity. So that kind of thing about the redesign is also ought to be possible around now.
Well, what may be interesting for people to know is that, and I brought this to the current ombudsman, we had a meeting yesterday, that the original SDO in 1995 that actually made reference for a golf club and for a practice range. When you look at the planning file, there is a consensus plan, which was done first, in which the practice range was nowhere near the golf, nowhere near the cemetery. And 3 months later, they produced a different plan called a master plan, in which the practice range had been moved directly above the cemetery. So there had to have been an awareness at the time. The cemetery was clearly marked. So why have an initial plan where it's not above the cemetery? And then they have a master plan which puts it right above the cemetery. And we don't know how that happened and why. And then that was signed off on by the minister of the day. So there were alternatives at the time. And I would say that with the blessing of the stakeholders involved, that currently both the Marsden Church and the Turkestown Historical Society are on the same page when it comes to the removal of the practice range, that it has to go somewhere else. And I don't think that they're going to back down on it this time.
And on that note, I would like to acknowledge in the audience Reverend Dr. Joseph Whalen, who is the current pastor of the Martha Methodist Church. So Dr. Whalen, it's good to have you here with us tonight. It's obvious that we're not going to get through all of the questions. I'm going to take, we're going to go to about another 10 minutes. and then I'm going to turn it back over. She probably is not expecting this, Dr. Draycott, to just close us out for the fine work that you have done in getting this all together. So I'm going to go through maybe 1 or 2 questions more before we close it out. And perhaps, I'm sure we're going to capture those questions, and perhaps Curb could post the answers to them on the website, since we won't get to all of them. And I do apologize, but I did want the speakers to have their full opportunity to speak. I think the question, what was the reason that Dr. Harris gave for demolishing the graves? I think that may have been addressed already. What was the possible legal right did he have to do it? So it's still on the same things. Here's a suggestion. Can we not raise the funds through crowdfunding to get some of the researchers who found the slave graves in the Caribbean? I think more public talk should be held on this. Great job to Leone. So yeah, we should be able to facilitate that. We see Keith Du Bois there making a comment, also part of the Tuckerstown Historical Society. Lynn Winfield, the president of CURB, is saying, yes, we do. We need to fund research by Ms. Jonas. So there's a lot of support for that. Let me see. Okay. Here's one for you, Ms. Jonas. Do you have any opinions as to the next steps for the cemetery? What if you can have your wish list of what would happen, what would that be? Unmute. Okay, there you go.
Okay. Initially, I would really like for us to be able to know what the size of the original cemetery was. It's important just in and of itself, but also we've been met with responses from those persons who have inherited the land around the cemetery, responses such as, we have no legal obligation to provide access, or almost acting as if they own the cemetery and they are allowing us to do whatever it is we are requesting to do. And Ms. Brock made the important point that at the time of the Bermuda Development Company Acts in 1920, the cemetery was exempt from purchase. The Methodist Act of 1880 disallowed it. And although a subsequent act was passed, which did allow with the majority of the congregation, there is no record of that decision ever being made. And so I believe I'm so grateful for Ms. Brock's presentation and the other professionals here, because it is so heartening to be told, and Dr. Blakey as well, that the descendants have to have a voice, because we have felt so ignored. We felt like we don't matter. And we feel like it's been an uphill battle. And so I feel emboldened now when I'm in meetings to say, no, you don't own the cemetery. Yes, you do have to provide access. That you don't own the land. That those are our ancestors, our remains. And so it is empowering just to be able to say that, to believe it, to believe in yourself, and to believe in the value the value of the lives of your ancestors, some of whom I didn't even get to know. Important to establish what the original cemetery was, so that we can assert that ownership and that ethical decision making as to what happens with it. I'm really passionate about the names of the people that are probably buried there, and we do have a tentative list of by process of elimination, if they're not buried in Hamilton Trinity Church Parish, if they're not buried in St. Mark's Smith's Parish, and they were resident in Tuckerstown when they died, which the death certificates do tell you that they were resident, then we can safely at least assume that they are buried there. One of the key burials that had to have taken place there was the whole family that perished in the tornado of Daniel Smith back in the 1870s. A tornado came through and his entire family, his wife, the unborn child, and at least 3 children ranging from less than 10 years old to teenage years, they all perished. And they had an inquest in Town just prior to their burial. And they are not buried at Trinity Church, and they are not buried at St. Mark's. So you had a family, a whole family, a funeral for a whole family that took place, which we don't have a record of. And so it's really heartwarming. I'm so grateful that I was asked to participate in this, and I would just love, the support going forward for this project, to find out the truth, to find out the actual parameters, to find out the names, and to move forward with dignity.
Yes, that is the critical piece, moving forward with dignity. There was a question that was asked earlier, flashing the screen, and it's come to my mind for the Bermudian delegation. Were there any people from the Enterprise buried at the Town grave? The Enterprise was the ship that came in Bermuda on its way to the United States. It was the, I think, the precedent case for freeing of this. The case, they used the in the Supreme Court of the United States used the argument that here in Bermuda, when the ship came in after the emancipation, that it was ruled in Bermuda courts that those persons on that ship had to be freed because they were in free territory. And so there are a lot of descendants of the Enterprise in 1835, I think it is, in Bermuda today. And the question was, were there any of those persons buried in Town? I'm not sure that there are, but that was a question that was raised, and perhaps that it could be something that is found out. I think that the time is well spent. I want to thank again our distinguished panelists. There was much food for thought here, and also they've given some ideas as to how we go forward, which is the important thing. It's one thing to have something like this, but now we've got some ideas. And in those days when we all used to go to conferences, they used to tell us, take 1 or 2 ideas and work on them right away, because you're going to get a lot out of it. But unless you pick 1 or 2 that you're going to work on, then you're probably going to come down off your high. And so one of the things that was very clear was that research of this nature has to be funded, and it has to be ongoing. And that's something that we can take away, and we can find a way. I'm sure Kurt will be talking about this at our next meeting. So I'm going to, without any further ado, turn it back over to Dr. Draycott for the final word. And then again, thank you all for participating. Thank you, audience, for joining with us. Many of you are still with us. We had over 80 something, and there's still 70 or so still in the chat. Dr. Draycott, if you want to step into the water now.
Thank you. I didn't expect to be closing out. And I would just like to say that I'm sincerely grateful to all of you for putting on an amazing set of presentations. It was really fascinating. I knew it wouldn't, stick within the time that we had allotted. There was no way. We knew this when we were discussing this last night, but it was so fascinating, and I'm really grateful because I'm Bermudian as well, and I feel glad to be able to give something back to a country that's given so much to me. That's all I have to say. I think hopefully we can look forward to more action, but maybe more discussion as well. So I did suggest yesterday that this begs a conference of some kind, I think, on the larger scale. And I agree that the Leone should get funding to do more of this research. So thank you so much, everybody. And I bid you good night from Durham. And shall I close out now? Okay.
Thank you, all of
Thank you very much.
Thank you. Thank you. Have a good night.
Good evening, everyone.
Bye. Thank you, Whitney. Thank
Bye-bye.
you, Danielle. Thank you, Leone.
Bye. So nice to meet you all.
Thank you. Bye.